Why do Israel and Palestine hate each other so much? Why can't the whole world find a solution to this conflict that satisfies everyone? Why are these two nations vying for 25,000 square miles of land burning under the sun? The solution to the Palestinian problem seems a little more problematic today than it was in 1948. That was when the State of Israel was declared and the Arab-Israeli War began. This conflict, which has claimed tens of thousands of lives over the past 70 years, sometimes subsides and sometimes escalates, but never stops. Palestinian militants are launching rocket attacks on Israeli cities from the Gaza Strip, all of them taking place today, at a time when there is no official fighting. The US, Russia and the UN are, as always, concerned about the situation and will hold consultations, but the conflict between Israel and Palestine will not end. The Jewish kingdom in Palestine broke up in the 1st century AD under the blows of the Roman Empire. The masters of the region have changed several times since then. But the Jews, scattered across European countries, regarded the land as a sacred homeland to which they were to return. Theodor Herzl, Austro-Hungarian journalist and founder of the Jewish state, wrote a pamphlet called The Jewish State in 1896. In it, Herzl called on the world community to help Jews establish their own state in Palestine. A year later he founded the World Zionist Organization. Zionism is the ideology of Jews returning to their historic homeland and establishing their own state there. Gradually, but steadily, the migration of Jews to Palestine is growing. They are helped by wealthy Jews in Europe, Rothschilds, Montefiores, who raise money to buy land in Palestine. By the mid-19th century there were about 400,000 people living in Palestine, of whom only 6,000 were Jews and the rest were Sunni Arabs. Palestine was a poor province of the Ottoman Empire, and the land was mainly owned by large Arab feudal lords who leased the land to peasants. The World Zionist Organization bought the land from the same feudal lords, and then both the seller and the buyer put the peasants on terms: you no longer have the right to live here. In other words, the aliens deprived the phallus of a place to live and work. The main reason for the conflict was wars, violence and territorial disputes. It all started with the sale of this land. For the Jews who immigrated to Palestine, this migration was a return to their homeland after hundreds of years of exile. For the Arabs who had lived in the area for centuries, the migration of the Jews was an attack by uninvited guests. For them, it was as if strangers came to your house and claimed that their ancestors had lived here in ancient times and therefore this was their home. At the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The League of Nations, an international organization that existed between the two world wars, similar to the UN, announced that temporary control of Palestine would be transferred to the United Kingdom. Because of the tensions between the two world wars in Europe, Jewish migration to Palestine accelerated. By the late 1930s, the Jewish community in Palestine had grown to 400,000, and political parties and illegal militias had emerged. The number of Arabs was approaching 1 million and they also had their own military groups. After World War II, the UN came to the conclusion that a single state of Jews and Arabs was out of the question, that massacres could begin immediately. It decided to divide the region into two, a Jewish state and an Arab state, depending on the location of the population. Jerusalem, the city of three religions, was declared an international territory. The Jewish community in Palestine agreed to the plan, but the Arabs did not want to hear about it either. If any part of Palestine is touched by the Jews, it will be left in flames and blood, said a spokesman for the Arab High Committee. The UN remained adamant. A resolution to partition Palestine was passed on November 29, 1947. With the declaration of Israel's independence, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, Iraq and others invaded Israel. The demand was firm: Palestine must belong to the Arabs and the Jews could leave wherever they wanted. But no results were achieved by the Arab states. By July 1949, Israel had repelled all attacks and destroyed the invading armies. At the same time it was occupying another 1,300 square kilometers of land over and above the land allocated in the UN plan. Egypt, Gaza Strip, and Jordan, West Bank and East Jerusalem, took control of the remaining territory allocated for the establishment of an Arab state in Palestine. In 1967, Egypt and Syria deployed large armies on their borders with Israel. The Jews saw this as preparation for an attack and launched a preemptive strike on June 5. Israel disbanded the Arab Coalition Air Force in 6 days, an event that went down in history as the Six-Day War. The West Bank, the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, which had belonged to Jordan since 1949, as well as the Golan Heights in Syria, passed to Israel at the end of the war. East Jerusalem also remained under Israeli control. The Six-Day War is referred to by the Arabs as Naksa Takr. This time the defeat was even more painful than before and hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled their homes. Israel lost about 800 people and the Arab states lost about 15,000 troops. At the same time, Israel tripled its territory in the pre-war period. The status of Jerusalem, which has historically been important to both Muslims and Jews, remains an insurmountable obstacle in all negotiations between Israel and Palestine. Israel declared Jerusalem as its sole and indivisible capital in 1980, and the United Nations has called on the world community to recognize this decision as illegal. In negotiations with Israel to resolve the conflict, the Palestinian side is demanding a return to the pre-1967 borders, recognizing the West Bank and Gaza Strip as the territory of a Palestinian state. The problem is that before 1967 Jerusalem did not belong entirely to Israel. Israel is against giving even half of Jerusalem to the Palestinians, especially from a security point of view. East Jerusalem's international airport is very well targeted. In a situation where the Palestinian leadership is difficult to call stable, Israel considers it impossible to give up East Jerusalem. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict should not be confused with the Arab-Israeli conflict. After the Six-Day War, the members of the formerly united anti-Israeli front, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, increasingly act in their own interests. They disguise their aims with statements like Arab unity and support for the Palestinian brothers, while it is only the Palestinians who are concerned about the Palestinians. Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat began the Oslo process, mediated by US President Clinton, with a series of meetings in the Norwegian capital to discuss ways to solve the Palestinian problem. As a result, a temporary agreement was reached in 1993 to 1995. A Palestinian National Authority, which was effectively the Palestinian government, was established and the Gaza Strip and a small part of the West Bank came under its administrative control. At the same time Israel controlled the borders of the administration, nothing was yet said about independence. This was to be the subject of further negotiations. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who had signed a peace treaty with Jordan in 1995 and paved the way for a truce with the Palestinians, was shot dead by Yigal Amir, who was protecting the people of Israel from the Oslo Accords. Despite Rabin's death, the reconciliation process continued. The summit at Camp David, USA, in 2000, when Arafat and the new Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak were to sign an agreement for a full Palestinian state, brokered by Bill Clinton, was supposed to be the culmination of the process. But it did not happen. Arafat was not offered independence for East Jerusalem and the return of all Palestinians to their homes, and his demand for an Israeli withdrawal from the future Palestinian state was not accepted. As a result, the contract was not signed. In 2004, Arafat died. Clinton was no longer President of the United States and Barak was no longer Prime Minister of Israel. After 2000, the prospect of peace between Israel and Palestine began to fade. In 2005, Ariel Sharon, the Israeli Prime Minister, allowed the Gaza Strip to decide its own fate as part of a plan for unilateral secession. He withdrew all troops and destroyed the settlements. Eventually, Hamas members came to power in Gaza, pressuring the FOT, and began firing rockets at Israel, in response to which Israel imposed an economic blockade. Sharon's move was seen as a failure. Gaza was now a greater source of instability for Israel than ever before, with Israel conducting 3 military operations, in 2008, 2012 and 2014, to clean up the Strip. On top of this, 2 government systems have emerged, Hamas in Gaza and the FOT on the West Coast. There are even more important and urgent conflicts on the global agenda: the war in Syria, the conflict in eastern Ukraine, North Korea's nuclear program, Iran. At the moment no one is trying to solve the Palestinian problem.